The Montblanc pen felt entirely too heavy for what it was about to do. Across the polished mahogany table, Brucey checked his Rolex, a Daytona he bought after closing his Series B funding, annoyance flickering in his jawline. He was waiting for her to cry, to beg for a better settlement, to do anything but sit there in absolute, unnerving silence. But Claire just stared at the divorce decree, at the miserable little alimony he'd fought so hard to restrict, and dragged the nib across the dotted line. She handed it back without a single tear. Brucey smiled, thinking he had just cleanly cut away the dead weight. He had no idea the ink wasn't just ending their marriage, it was signing away his entire empire. Claire Belmont sat in the suffocatingly sterile conference room of Hayes and Kensington LLP in downtown Chicago. The air conditioning was turned up too high, a deliberate tactic, her lawyer had warned her, to make the opposing party uncomfortable. Across from her sat Brucey, her husband of 6 years. Well, soon-to-be ex-husband. He was flanked by 2 aggressive-looking litigators from a white shoe firm, guys who looked like they billed thousands of dollars just to breathe the room's oxygen. Brucey looked good. That was the most agonizing part. He wore a bespoke navy suit, the kind you buy when your tech startup, Aegis Edge Technologies, is on the verge of a 9-figure acquisition. He was glowing with the arrogance of a man who believed he had outgrown his starter wife. "Claire," Brucey said, his tone dripping with a practiced, patronizing sympathy. "I know this is hard, but this settlement is more than fair. The $2 million, the house in Evanston, it's enough to keep you comfortable. But you have to understand, Aegis is my life's work. I can't have my equity tied up in a messy marital dispute right before the buyout." Claire stared at his perfectly styled hair. She remembered the man she had met in a crowded coffee shop near Northwestern University, a hungry coder with big dreams and empty pockets. She had worked 2 jobs as a university archivist to pay their rent while he coded in their tiny apartment. She had sold her grandmother's vintage Cartier watch to buy the servers he needed for his first major client. She had loved him with a quiet, fierce devotion, and he had repaid her by handing her an NDA and a severance package from their marriage, all to protect his assets and clear the runway for his VP of Public Relations, Serena Carlyle. Claire knew about Serena. She knew about the business trips to Silicon Valley, the late-night texts, the perfume lingering on his coats. Claire looked down at the paper. $2 million. To a normal person, it was a fortune. To Brucey, who was about to net $60 million in the upcoming acquisition by a private equity behemoth, it was a rounding error. It was hush money. Her own lawyer, a mild-mannered family attorney named David, leaned in. "Claire, we can fight this. The prenup is ironclad regarding premarital assets, yes, but given his recent influx of capital and the circumstantial evidence of infidelity, we can push for discovery on Aegis Edge's actual valuation." "No," Claire said softly. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it silenced the room. Brucey's lead attorney sneered. "A wise choice, Mrs. Belmont. Protracted litigation would only drain the assets you are currently being offered." Brucey had never known the truth about her family. When they met, Claire was estranged from her father, Richard Sterling. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was apex predator wealthy. He founded Sterling Global Holdings, a deeply private equity firm that partnered with giants like Apollo Global Management to quietly buy, gut, and sell companies across the globe. He was the kind of man who played golf with senators and had the SEC on speed dial. Claire had walked away from that suffocating world of wealth and paranoia at 18, changing her last name to her mother's maiden name, choosing to live as an ordinary academic. Brucey thought her father was a retired insurance adjuster somewhere in Connecticut. Claire picked up the pen. She didn't read the clauses. She didn't care about the Evanston house or the 2 million. She just wanted the suffocating weight off her chest. She signed her name. Claire Belmont. For the last time. Brucey let out a breath he had been holding. A smug, victorious smile touched the corners of his lips. "It's for the best, Claire. You'll see." She stood up, buttoning her simple beige trench coat. "Goodbye, Brucey," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. She walked out of the law office and into the biting Chicago wind. She pulled her phone from her pocket. She scrolled past the unanswered texts from Brucey's mother, past the lawyer's number, and stopped at a contact she hadn't called in 6 years. She pressed dial. It rang exactly once. "Claire!" A deep, gravelly voice answered. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of inevitability. "Dad!" Claire said, a single tear finally escaping the corner of her eye. "I'm coming home, and I need a favor." Brucey Belmont stood on the balcony of his penthouse in the Gold Coast, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. The city lights of Chicago sprawled out before him, a glittering carpet laid out explicitly for his triumph. It was Friday night, exactly 3 days since Claire had signed the papers. 3 days since he had officially shed the last anchor, holding him back from the stratosphere. Behind him, the soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of expensive jazz filled the living room. It was an intimate gathering, just the senior executives of Aegis Edge Technologies and a few key investors who had backed him early on. A pair of slender arms wrapped around his waist from behind. The scent of Baccarat Rouge 540 filled his senses. Serena. "You're hiding from your own victory party," Serena purred, resting her chin on his shoulder. She was everything Claire wasn't. Loud, aggressively ambitious, impeccably tailored, and brutally pragmatic. With the ink dry on the divorce, there was no need for secrets anymore. Brucey chuckled, leaning back into her. "Just taking a moment to appreciate the view. In 48 hours, Aegis officially becomes part of the Vanguard equity portfolio. My shares vest, the cash hits the accounts, and we step into the big leagues." Serena stepped beside him, clinking her champagne flute against his Scotch glass. "You pulled it off, Brucey. You got the company to 150 million valuation, and you managed to cut the dead weight before she could legally demand half of it." A flicker of guilt, tiny and insignificant, passed through Brucey's mind at the mention of Claire. She had made it so easy. Almost too easy. He had expected her to hire some bulldog lawyer and drag him through the mud. But she had just folded. It proved what he had always known. Claire wasn't built for the high-stakes world. "She got the Evanston house," Brucey said, waving his hand dismissively. "And enough cash to buy all the dusty old books she wants. It's a win-win." "But let's talk about Monday. Vanguard has been weirdly quiet about the final boardroom logistics." Serena frowned slightly. "Their lead negotiator, a guy named Harrison, reached out this morning. He said the parent company's CEO wants to be there in person to sign the final transition documents. Apparently, this acquisition caught the attention of the absolute top brass." Brucey's chest puffed out. "Well, our predictive AI model is industry disrupting. It makes sense the big boss wants to shake my hand." Vanguard Equity was a massive entity, but notoriously secretive. They operated through a web of shell corporations. Brucey didn't care who they were, as long as the check cleared. The weekend passed in a blur of champagne, self-congratulations, and high-end restaurants. Brucey was already looking at a summer home in the Hamptons. He had completely erased Claire from his mind. Meanwhile, across town, in a sprawling, heavily guarded estate in Lake Forest, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. Richard Sterling sat behind a massive oak desk, the only light in the room coming from a green glass banker's lamp. He was 68, with sharp, hawkish features, and silver hair that was always impeccably styled. He didn't look like a grandfather, he looked like a sovereign. Claire sat on the leather sofa opposite him, nursing a cup of tea. She looked exhausted, but the perpetual shadow of anxiety that had hung over her for the last year of her marriage was gone. "The due diligence is complete," Richard said, his voice a low rumble. He adjusted his reading glasses, staring at a thick dossier stamped with the Aegis Edge logo. "His algorithm is decent, overvalued by about 40%, built on a foundation of aggressive marketing rather than actual technological superiority, but acceptable." "I don't care about the algorithm, Dad," Claire said quietly. Richard looked up, his pale blue eyes piercing. He had spent 6 years respecting his daughter's wish for distance. When she had called him, weeping in the cold, a terrifying rage had awakened in the billionaire's chest. No one discarded a Sterling. "I know you don't," Richard said softly, "but I care about the principle. He thought he could steal your prime years, use your loyalty, and then throw you away with a pittance to protect his little tech toy." Richard closed the folder with a sharp snap. "He values this company above you, above his vows. So I bought it." Claire looked at her father. "Is everything ready for Monday?" "Yes. Vanguard Equity is fully controlled by Sterling Global. They've been instructed to hold the final signing at my corporate headquarters, not theirs." Richard leaned back, a dark, predatory smile forming. "He thinks he's ascending to Olympus, Claire. On Monday, we show him he's just a bug on the windshield." Monday morning arrived with a cold, driving rain that lashed against the glass towers of the Loop. Brucey Belmont stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. Today was the climax of a decade of hustle. "Ready to become a legend?" Serena asked, stepping into the foyer. She was dressed in a sharp, slate-grey power suit, carrying the leather briefcase that held the final hard copies of the intellectual property transfers. "I was born ready," Brucey smirked. A black Cadillac Escalade, sent by the buyers, was waiting for them downstairs. Brucey found it slightly odd that the driver didn't take them to Vanguard's well-known offices on Wacker Drive. Instead, the SUV navigated through the heavy morning traffic toward a sleek, monolithic skyscraper on South Riverside Plaza, a building known to house only ultra-high net worth family offices and private, unnamed equity firms. They arrived at the building and were escorted by silent, imposing security guards to a private elevator. There were no buttons inside, just a keycard scanner. The elevator shot upward until it chimed smoothly at the 65th floor. The doors opened into a sprawling reception area made entirely of black marble and brushed steel. There was no logo on the wall, no receptionist, just a pair of massive, soundproof oak double doors at the end of a long hallway. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit was waiting for them. "Mr. Belmont, Miss Carlyle, right this way. The chairman is waiting." Brucey's heart hammered against his ribs. The chairman. He strode forward, projecting absolute confidence. The oak doors swung open. The boardroom was cavernous. A 30-foot mahogany table stretched across the center, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the stormy expanse of Lake Michigan. At the far end of the table, sitting in a high-backed leather chair, a man sat with his back to them, looking out at the rain. To his left stood Harrison, the Vanguard negotiator Brucey had been dealing with for months. To his right stood a phalanx of 3 severe-looking corporate lawyers. "Harrison," Brucey boomed, walking into the room with a wide, practiced smile, his hand outstretched. "Good to see you in person. Hell of an office." Harrison didn't smile. He didn't step forward to shake Brucey's hand. He simply gave a curt nod. "Mr. Belmont, please take a seat." Brucey's smile faltered slightly. He pulled out a chair halfway down the table, Serena sitting beside him, opening her briefcase. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like an execution chamber. "We have the final IP transfer documents right here," Serena said, her voice piercing the silence, though it lacked its usual brassy confidence. "We're ready to finalize the wire transfer upon signature." The man at the head of the table slowly swiveled his chair around. Brucey frowned. He didn't recognize him. He was older, with silver hair and eyes as cold and grey as the lake outside. He radiated an aura of absolute authority. "Mr. Belmont," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that echoed in the cavernous room. "I've been looking forward to this meeting." "The pleasure is mine, sir," Brucey said, recovering his swagger. "I assume you are the head of Vanguard Equity?" "Vanguard Equity is a shell," the man replied evenly, steepling his fingers. "A subsidiary holding company created specifically for the acquisition of distressed or overvalued tech assets. It is wholly owned by Sterling Global Holdings." Brucey's brow furrowed. Sterling. The name nagged at the back of his mind, but he couldn't place it. Sterling Global. Impressive. Well, I can assure you, Aegis Edge is far from distressed. "Oh, I disagree, Brucey," a new voice said. It came from a side door near the head of the table. A door Brucey hadn't noticed. The handle turned, and a woman walked into the boardroom. Brucey's breath caught in his throat. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him feeling cold and lightheaded. Serena gasped softly beside him. It was Claire. But she looked nothing like the woman who had quietly signed divorce papers in a cheap trench coat 3 days ago. She was wearing a stunning, tailored white Alexander McQueen pantsuit. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, fell in perfect sleek waves over her shoulders. She wore a pair of diamond earrings that easily cost more than Brucey's entire penthouse. The quiet, submissive aura was gone, replaced by an icy, untouchable elegance. She walked over to the head of the table and stood right behind the silver-haired billionaire, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Claire," Brucey choked out, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" Richard Sterling leaned forward, the predatory smile finally breaking across his face. "Brucey, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Richard Sterling, Chairman and CEO of Sterling Global." He patted the hand resting on his shoulder. "And this is my daughter, Claire Sterling, though I believe you knew her as Claire Belmont." The room started to spin. Brucey gripped the edge of the mahogany table to steady himself. No, it was impossible. Her father was a retired insurance adjuster. They were normal people. "You," Brucey stammered, looking from the billionaire to his ex-wife. "You bought my company?" Claire looked down at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no vindictiveness, just a profound, chilling pity. "No, Brucey," Claire said softly, the silence of the room hanging on her every word. "I didn't buy your company." Richard pushed a thick black folder across the polished table. It slid to a halt exactly in front of Brucey. "I bought it," Richard corrected, his tone turning to steel. "And according to the revised terms of the hostile takeover we executed through Vanguard at 3 a.m. this morning, capitalizing on the hidden mezzanine debt you so carelessly ignored, you don't own Aegis anymore. And you aren't getting $60 million. Brucey frantically tore open the folder. His eyes darted over the legal jargon, the financial structuring, the clauses. He was a smart man, and it only took him 10 seconds to realize what he was looking at. They hadn't just bought his company. They had cornered his debt, triggered a default clause he didn't even know existed, and executed a ruthless, perfectly legal corporate raid. His equity was wiped out. "You," Brucey whispered, looking up at Claire, his world collapsing into ash. "You planned this." "I just signed the papers, Brucey," Claire replied, her voice echoing the coldness of the room. "Just like you asked me to." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, save for the steady drumming of rain against the 65th floor windows. Brucey's eyes darted wildly across the legal documents, his mind struggling to process the dense paragraphs of Delaware corporate law and debt covenants. The letters seemed to blur together, swimming on the page. "This is illegal," Brucey finally rasped, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard Sterling. "You can't just seize my equity. I own 51% of Aegis Edge. I have board control." Richard let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. "You had board control, Brucey, until you got greedy." Harrison, the vanguard negotiator, stepped forward, opening his own leather-bound folder. He no longer looked like a partner. He looked like an executioner. 14 months ago, Mr. Belmont, in order to artificially inflate your user acquisition metrics prior to seeking a buyer, you secured a $12 million mezzanine bridge loan from Crescent Point Capital. Brucey swallowed hard. The room felt uncomfortably hot. Crescent Point was supposed to be a secret, a shadow lender that provided fast liquidity to tech founders desperate to polish their balance sheets. "Crescent Point is a subsidiary of Sterling Global Holdings," Richard stated flatly. "We bought their entire distressed tech portfolio 8 months ago. Which means, Brucey, you owe me $12 million. A loan backed by a personal guarantee and collateralized by your controlling shares in Aegis Edge." Serena, sitting frozen next to Brucey, finally moved. She grabbed the documents, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the paper as she read the clauses. Her face went ashen. "You missed a covenant, Brucey," Richard continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "A technicality regarding debt-to-equity ratios that triggered a default the moment you signed your divorce papers and transferred $2 million in liquid capital to Claire. The bridge loan accelerated. We executed the capital call at 3 a.m. You couldn't pay. Your shares were forfeited to the creditor. That's us." Brucey turned to Serena, his eyes pleading for a lifeline. "Serena, tell them our lawyers at Skadden reviewed this. There's a cure period. We have 30 days to rectify a technical default." Serena didn't look at him. She was staring at Claire. The woman she had mocked in private texts as a mousy little librarian was standing there in a bespoke white pantsuit, radiating the kind of generational power that Serena had spent her entire life trying to climb toward. Serena was ruthless, but she was also a realist. She instantly calculated the odds, and she knew a sinking ship when she saw one. "There is no cure period for a change of control violation, Brucey," Serena said softly, pushing the documents back toward him. She closed her leather briefcase with a sharp click. "Serena?" Brucey whispered, completely blindsided. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm the VP of Public Relations," she replied, her tone perfectly clipped and professional, a terrifying pivot from the affectionate partner she had been hours prior. She looked up at Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, I was unaware of Mr. Belmont's reckless financial engineering. I assure you, the rest of the executive team at Aegis operates with full transparency." Brucey felt his stomach drop. The betrayal was instantaneous and complete. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "We won't be needing a PR department for Aegis, Ms. Carlyle. We are stripping the predictive algorithm for parts to integrate into our logistics divisions and liquidating the rest of the company. You and the entire C-suite are terminated effective immediately. Your severance packages will be mailed to you." "You're gutting my company?" Brucey yelled, finally finding his rage. He slammed his fists on the table, standing up so violently his chair tipped backward. "I built Aegis from the ground up. You can't just tear it apart." Claire finally stepped forward. The icy detachment in her eyes was more devastating than any anger could have been. "You didn't build it alone, Brucey," she said, her voice cutting through his shouting. "I worked double shifts to pay the rent while you coded. I proofread your pitch decks. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to buy your first server rack. I built the foundation so you could reach the sky." She paused, looking at his Daytona watch, his bespoke suit, the sheer arrogance that still clung to him even as his empire burned. "And when you reached the top, you decided I didn't fit the aesthetic," Claire continued. "You wanted a trophy, not a partner. You wanted me to disappear quietly with a $2 million gag order so you could marry your publicist and play billionaire." "Claire, please," Brucey stammered, his rage faltering as the reality of his utter ruin began to set in. The $60 million payout was gone. The company was gone. "We can fix this. I'll tear up the divorce papers. We can negotiate." "The papers are signed and filed, Brucey," Claire said softly. "The $2 million you forced upon me was exactly the amount needed to drain your liquid reserves and trigger your debt default. You engineered your own destruction. I just let you." Richard Sterling pressed a button under the lip of the mahogany table. The heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom swung open, and two massive stone-faced security guards stepped inside. "The meeting is concluded," Richard said, turning his back to Brucey and looking out the window over the stormy lake. "Escort Mr. Belmont and Miss Carlyle from the building. If they resist, have them arrested for trespassing." The elevator ride down to the lobby was suffocatingly silent. Brucey stood rigidly in the corner, staring blankly at the brushed steel doors. Serena stood as far away from him as physically possible, aggressively typing on her phone, already leveraging her network, trying to salvage her own career before the news of Aegis Edge's collapse hit the tech blogs. When they hit the lobby, the security guards didn't say a word. They simply pointed toward the revolving glass doors. Outside, the Chicago rain was pouring in sheets. The temperature had dropped, the wind howling off the lake. "Serena," Brucey said, reaching out to grab her arm as she stepped under the awning. "We need to call Skadden. We need to file an injunction. We can sue Sterling Global for predatory lending practices." Serena snatched her arm away, her eyes flashing with disdain. "With what money, Brucey? Your accounts are tied up in the default. Your equity is zero. Skadden Partners bill $2,000 an hour. You can't even afford the retainer." "We're in this together," Brucey pleaded, his perfectly styled hair now plastering to his forehead from the damp wind. "We were going to buy a house in the Hamptons. We're partners." Serena let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "We were partners when you had a $60 million valuation. Now, you're a bankrupt tech bro with a leveraged penthouse and a pissed-off billionaire father-in-law." A sleek black Uber pulled up to the curb, splashing water onto Brucey's expensive Italian leather shoes. "Good luck, Brucey," Serena said, pulling her trench coat tight. "Don't call me." She slipped into the back of the car, and the Uber sped away, blending into the sea of grey traffic. Brucey stood alone in the freezing rain. Panic, raw and metallic, finally clawed its way up his throat. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed David, the high-priced litigator he had hired for the divorce. It went straight to voicemail. He dialed his primary investor on Sand Hill Road. Voicemail. It was as if a silent alarm had been triggered across the financial world, and Brucey Belmont was suddenly radioactive. He hailed a cab, sitting shivering in the back seat as it crawled through traffic toward his Gold Coast penthouse. He needed his laptop. He needed to check his personal banking portals. There had to be a loophole. When he arrived at his luxury high-rise, he bypassed the concierge, heading straight for the private elevator. He scanned his key fob. The scanner beeped a harsh, angry red. Access denied. Brucey frowned. He wiped the fob on his wet jacket and scanned it again. Red. Mr. Belmont. Brucey turned. The building manager, a stern-looking man named Gregory, was walking toward him from the concierge desk, flanked by a building security officer. Gregory did not look accommodating. "Gregory, my fob is malfunctioning," Brucey demanded, trying to project authority. "Fix it." "It's not malfunctioning, sir," Gregory said evenly, handing Brucey a sealed manila envelope. "We received a notice from the asset management firm that holds the deed to your penthouse. The lease agreement was secured under the Aegis Edge corporate umbrella, backed by your founder's shares." Brucey snatched the envelope, his hands shaking so badly he tore the paper trying to open it. "The shares have been seized in a corporate debt restructuring," Gregory continued, devoid of any sympathy. "The lease is in default. You have been locked out. We have boxed up your personal effects, clothes, watches, and personal electronics. They are currently being held in the loading dock." "You can't do this!" Brucey screamed, the polished veneer of the tech CEO completely shattering. "I live here. You need to give me 30 days' notice. This is an illegal eviction." "It's a commercial lease seizure, sir," Gregory corrected gently, though there was a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. Brucey had notoriously treated the building staff like peasants for 3 years. Sterling Global Real Estate Division now owns the leasehold. You are welcome to take it up with their legal department. Now please accompany the guard to the loading dock to collect your boxes. 3 hours later, Brucey Belmont found himself sitting in a cheap motel room in Schaumburg, an hour outside the city. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial bleach. 3 cardboard boxes containing his designer suits, his Rolex Daytona, and his laptop sat on the stained carpet. He opened his laptop, connecting to the motel's unsecured Wi-Fi. He logged into his personal banking portal. His checking account balance, $4,212. His savings account, which had housed the $2 million he had intended to use for a down payment on the Hamptons house, empty. The funds had been automatically swept by the bank the moment the mezzanine debt default hit his credit profile, a standard clause in aggressive bridge loans. He had nothing. He stared at the blinking cursor on his screen, the full, crushing weight of Richard Sterling's trap closing in on him. Claire hadn't just taken her settlement and walked away. She had deliberately accepted the exact terms required to disarm him, knowing her father was waiting in the shadows to strike. Brucey grabbed his phone and scrolled to Claire's name. His thumb hovered over the call button. He hated her. He feared her. But more than anything, he needed her to stop this. He pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a recorded voice chimed in. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been disconnected, or is no longer in service." Brucey threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the cheap drywall, falling in pieces onto the floor. He buried his face in his hands, alone in the silence, finally realizing that the woman he thought was collateral damage had been the architect of his total ruin. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in corporate erasure. Brucey Belmont, once the golden boy of the Chicago tech scene, found himself entirely blacklisted. He had spent his remaining $4,000 on a retainer for a mid-tier defense attorney named Benjamin Hayes, a man whose office smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, a far cry from the glass and steel skyscrapers Brucey was accustomed to. But after reviewing the acquisition files, Benjamin had simply slid the paperwork back across his cluttered desk. "You have no case, Mr. Belmont," Benjamin had said, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing his eyes. Sterling Global didn't steal your company. They bought your debt. You agreed to the covenants when you took Crescent Point's money. You violated the change of control clause when you finalized your divorce and transferred the $2 million. It's a ruthless, predatory squeeze-out. Yes. But it is 100% legal. If you try to sue Richard Sterling, his legal team will tie you up in litigation until you are bankrupt, and then they'll countersue for legal fees. Brucey had walked out of that office feeling like a ghost. The tech blogs had already moved on. TechCrunch and Wired ran brief articles on Vanguard Equity's absorption of Aegis Edge, noting that the founders had stepped down to pursue other opportunities. There was no mention of the hostile takeover. Sterling Global's PR machine was a fortress. They controlled the narrative flawlessly. Desperation breeds obsession. Brucey spent his days in the dingy Schaumburg motel, stalking Claire's digital footprint. He discovered she had entirely dropped the name Belmont. Claire Sterling was now sitting on the board of directors for Sterling Global's philanthropic arm, managing a 9-figure endowment for educational technology. He needed to see her. He needed to look her in the eye. He convinced himself that if he could just talk to her, just remind her of the hungry kids they used to be in that tiny Evanston apartment, she would feel guilty. She would throw him a bone, a consulting gig, a fractional share, anything to get him out of this cheap motel. He found his opportunity on a crisp Thursday evening. The Field Museum was hosting an exclusive black tie charity gala, sponsored by Sterling Global. Brucey put on his one remaining bespoke tuxedo, the fabric feeling like a mocking reminder of his former life, and spent his last $100 on a black car to take him to the museum campus. He didn't have a ticket, so he waited in the shadows near the VIP valet entrance, the cold October wind biting through his jacket. At 11:30 p.m., the heavy brass doors of the museum opened. A small crowd of Chicago's elite spilled out, laughing, wrapped in expensive coats. And there she was. Claire looked breathtaking. She wore a floor-length emerald green gown that caught the ambient light, a vintage diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She was laughing at something the museum's curator was saying, flanked by 2 discreet, broad-shouldered security details. Brucey stepped out of the shadows. "Claire!" The security guards instantly stepped forward, their hands hovering near their lapels, but Claire raised a single, gloved hand to stop them. She looked at Brucey. Her smile faded, replaced by that same terrifying, oceanic calm she had worn in the boardroom. "Brucey," she said, her voice perfectly level, "you shouldn't be here." "I have nothing, Claire," Brucey blurted out, the rehearsed speech dying in his throat. He sounded pathetic, and he hated it, but he couldn't stop. "The accounts are frozen. The penthouse is gone. I'm living in a motel. You took everything." Claire stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the edge of the illuminated stone steps. The security detail stayed exactly 3 paces behind her. "I didn't take anything that wasn't legally forfeited, Brucey," she replied softly. "You built a house of cards on toxic debt and lied to everyone about it. My father simply blew on it." "You set me up!" Brucey hissed, his anger flaring, looking around to ensure no one was recording them. "That $2 million settlement. You knew it would trigger the covenant." "Of course I knew," Claire said, tilting her head slightly. "Did you really think I was just a naive librarian? While you were taking Serena Carlyle on investor relations trips to Cabo, I was reviewing the mail you left on the kitchen counter. I saw the Crescent Point letterhead. I knew what mezzanine debt was. And when I ran the name past my father's risk analysts, they saw the trap you set for yourself." Brucey felt the blood drain from his face. You knew about Serena? I knew about Serena. I knew about the waitress in Austin. I knew about the angel investor in New York, Claire said, her voice devoid of any heartbreak. She had clearly mourned this marriage a long time ago. You thought because I was quiet, I was blind. You thought because I didn't wear designer labels, I didn't understand leverage. Brucey swallowed hard, staring at the woman he realized he had never truly known. So this was all just revenge, a petty, billion-dollar revenge plot. Claire let out a soft, humorless laugh. She looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline, the city that Brucey thought he had conquered. It wasn't revenge, Brucey. It was a reclaiming of equity, she said, turning her piercing gaze back to him. Do you remember the core predictive sorting algorithm? The one that Vanguard actually wanted? The one that made Aegis Edge valuable? Brucey frowned. Of course. I coded it in 2019. You coded the interface, Claire corrected, her tone turning razor-sharp. But the underlying data sorting logic, the foundational architecture that allowed the AI to categorize unstructured variables, was based entirely on the archival taxonomy thesis I wrote for my master's degree. I spent 6 months explaining it to you over dinner while you took notes. Brucey opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Sterling Global's IP lawyers reviewed your patent filings, Claire continued. You claimed sole authorship of an architecture you didn't invent. Last week, my father's legal team filed an addendum with the US Patent Office, proving my prior academic work as the source code's foundation. We didn't just buy your company, Brucey. We patented the brain inside it under my name. Brucey's knees felt weak. He took a step back, hitting the cold stone of a pillar. He wasn't just broke. His entire legacy as a tech visionary was a lie that had just been legally dismantled. You have nothing left to sell, Brucey, Claire said, stepping into the back of a waiting Bentley that had silently pulled up to the curb. Go home. Learn to live like the rest of the world. The door closed with a heavy, expensive thud. The Bentley pulled away, its taillights bleeding into the wet Chicago night, leaving Brucey Belmont completely, utterly alone. 8 months later, the unforgiving August sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of a strip mall parking lot in Round Rock, Texas. Brucey Belmont sat behind the wheel of a 2011 Toyota Camry, staring blankly through a windshield smeared with dead insects and Texas dust. The air conditioning was broken, blowing only tepid sour air into the cabin. But Brucey didn't have the $300 required to fix the compressor. He gripped the worn plastic steering wheel, his knuckles white, remembering the supple, hand-stitched leather of the Porsche 911 he had test-driven just days before, signing his divorce papers. He was 34 years old, but his reflection in the rearview mirror showed a man who had aged a decade in less than a year. The bespoke navy suits and the glowing arrogance were gone, replaced by a faded short-sleeve button-down from a discount rack and deep, dark hollows under his eyes. He stepped out into the suffocating 100-degree heat and walked toward a low-slung, beige concrete building. The faded sign above the glass double doors read, Sunbelt Freight and Logistics, Regional Hub. This was his new empire, a cubicle farm that smelled permanently of burnt Folgers coffee and ozone from overworked copy machines. His title was Junior Systems Analyst, a role that paid $42,000 a year. His daily task was to maintain a legacy SQL database, tracking the shipment of industrial fertilizers across the American Southwest. It was mind-numbing, soul-crushing work, the kind of job the old Brucey Belmont would have automated with a single script and then fired the entire department for being obsolete. But Brucey couldn't automate anything here. He was paralyzed by a non-compete and a sprawling intellectual property injunction filed by Sterling Global's fleet of attorneys, effectively banning him from touching any predictive architecture for the next 10 years. He swiped his badge, the plastic clip digging into his chest, and walked past the receptionist without a word. He settled into cubicle 4B, a grey box decorated only with a single, unwatered succulent. Before logging into his terminal to run the morning routing reports, Brucey pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket. It was a cheap prepaid model. His flagship smartphone had been surrendered during the asset seizure. He took a deep breath, scrolled through a sparse contact list, and dialed a number he had memorized from his days pitching on Sand Hill Road. It rang 4 times. Brucey's heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs. Finally, a voice picked up. "Greg Halpern," the voice answered, brisk and impatient. Halpern was a senior partner at Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm that had once courted Brucey aggressively before the Vanguard acquisition. "Greg, it's Brucey Belmont." There was a profound, suffocating silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually preceded a hung-up phone. "Brucey," Greg finally said, his tone shifting from professional to dangerously cold. "How did you get this direct line? I changed my number in January." "I have my ways, Greg. Listen, please just give me 90 seconds, Brucey pleaded, hating the wet, desperate sound of his own voice. "I've been working on something new, a decentralized ledger application for supply chain verification. It bypasses the IP injunction entirely. It's clean. I just need a seed round." 500,000. Hell, 200,000. I'll give you 40% equity right now. Another silence. Then a heavy sigh. "Brucey, stop," Greg said, the pity in his voice far worse than anger. "You don't get it, do you? You aren't just broke. You're radioactive. You're a walking contagion in the valley." "Greg, the tech is solid. You know I can code." "It doesn't matter if you can code the Matrix itself," Greg snapped, the professional veneer cracking. "Do you have any idea what Richard Sterling did to your reputation? His people didn't just seize Aegis Edge. They circulated the mezzanine debt default filings to every major Tier 1 and Tier 2 firm from San Francisco to New York. You were exposed as a founder who over-leveraged his company to hide a stagnant user base, triggered a technical default to screw his wife out of a settlement, and lost control of his own board. You are the ultimate cautionary tale of catastrophic risk management." "That's a lie," Brucey hissed, looking around the cubicle farm to make sure no one was listening. "The user base wasn't stagnant. The algorithm belonged to Claire Sterling," Greg interrupted brutally. "The patent addendum was made public 4 months ago. The industry knows you slapped a sleek UI on your wife's master's thesis and called yourself a visionary. Sterling Global just partnered with Amazon Web Services to integrate that exact algorithm into their global fulfillment network. The contract is worth $800 million. Brucey felt the blood drain from his head. The fluorescent lights above him seemed to flicker and buzz with mocking intensity. 800 million. "Lose this number, Brucey," Greg said quietly. "If you ever call me again, I'll forward the logs to Sterling's legal team and let them hit you with a harassment suit. Goodbye." The line went dead. Brucey slowly lowered the phone to his desk. His hands were shaking so violently he had to press them flat against the cheap laminate surface to steady them. He felt physically sick. The final delusion he had been clinging to, the belief that he could simply start over, that his sheer intellect would eventually outmaneuver Claire's billions, shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was trapped. Needing to see the knife that was twisting in his back, Brucey opened a private browser tab on his terminal. He typed Forbes Claire Sterling AWS into the search bar. The top result wasn't just an article. It was the digital cover story for the month. The headline stared back at him in bold, unrelenting black text. The Quiet Architect: How Claire Sterling Reclaimed Her Intellectual Property and Revolutionized AWS Logistics. Below the headline was a high-resolution photograph of Claire. She was standing in a sprawling, glass-walled server facility in Northern Virginia. She wore a simple, elegant black turtleneck and tailored trousers, devoid of the flashy, designer excess Brucey used to force upon her. She looked grounded, brilliant, and untouchably powerful. Brucey's eyes scanned the text, every word feeling like a physical blow. While tech mythology often celebrates the loud, disruptive founder, the true engine of Aegis Edge's valuation was its foundational sorting architecture. This architecture, it was recently revealed, was the brainchild of Claire Sterling, an archival taxonomist who spent years developing the logic while supporting her former husband's early ventures. Following a highly publicized corporate restructuring, Sterling Global Holdings legally integrated the True IP into a new subsidiary, Aegis Omnicorp. Under Claire Sterling's directorship, the streamlined algorithm caught the attention of Amazon Web Services. We realized the original code had been buried under unnecessary, flashy consumer interfaces, Ms. Sterling noted in a rare interview. Once we stripped away the ego, the math spoke for itself. Brucey stopped reading. Once we stripped away the ego, she wasn't just succeeding, she was publicly dismantling the very foundation of his self-worth. She had proven to the entire world that the only valuable thing Brucey Belmont had ever produced was the woman he had discarded. Further down the page, a sidebar detailed her new philanthropic endeavor. She had seeded a $50 million grant foundation, entirely self-funded, aimed at providing legal and financial counsel to spouses of high net worth founders facing aggressive, predatory divorce settlements. She had named it the Belmont Precedent Foundation. She had literally weaponized his name against him to fund his victims. "Hey, Artie." Brucey flinched, snapping out of his digital self-flagellation. He minimized the browser window instantly, his heart racing as if he had been caught looking at contraband. Standing at the entrance of his cubicle was Tyler, the 24-year-old logistics manager. Tyler wore a Patagonia fleece vest, despite the Texas heat, khaki chinos, and a pair of spotless white sneakers. He held a Yeti thermal mug and was chewing a piece of gum with lazy, open-mouthed arrogance. Tyler looked at Brucey the exact way Brucey used to look at the junior developers he had burned out and tossed aside in Chicago. "I need the Q3 regional freight manifests, Artie," Tyler said, tapping his knuckles against the cubicle wall. "And I noticed you didn't run the redundancy protocols on the servers last night." "I ran them, Tyler," Brucey said, his voice raspy and devoid of life. "The legacy system timed out. It needs a hard reboot from the main switch. I put in a ticket with IT." Tyler sighed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Yeah, see, putting in a ticket isn't really the disruptive mindset we're looking for here at Sunbelt. We need ownership, Artie. I need you to go down to the server room, manually reboot the stack, and then rerun the protocols. And I need the manifests on my desk before you clock out, which means you're probably staying until 8 tonight." Brucey stared at the kid. A year ago, he would have bought this kid's company just to fire him. He felt a sudden, terrifying surge of pure, unadulterated rage bubbling up in his chest. His hands balled into fists. He imagined standing up, grabbing Tyler by the collar of his expensive vest, and screaming into his face that he was Brucey Belmont, the man who had built a $150 million empire, the man who wore Rolexes that cost more than Tyler's entire annual salary. He imagined the satisfying crunch of overturning his desk, smashing the dual monitors, and walking out of this miserable beige prison. But then, the rage hit a wall. If he walked out, he lost the $42,000 a year. If he lost the job, he couldn't pay the rent on his cramped apartment. If he couldn't pay the rent, he would be sleeping in the rusted Toyota Camry. He had no equity. He had no network. He had no safety net. Richard and Claire Sterling had systematically dismantled every single escape route. The fire in Brucey's chest extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, suffocating ash. The fight was completely gone. He slowly unballed his fists. He looked away from Tyler's smug face and stared down at the cheap plastic keyboard in front of him. "Sure, Tyler," Brucey whispered, the words tasting like copper in his mouth. "I'll go down to the server room. I'll get the manifests done." "Awesome. Synergize that back end, Artie. We're counting on you," Tyler said with a mock salute, turning on his heel and walking away, wholly unaware that he had just issued orders to a ghost. Brucey sat in the silence of Cubicle 4B. He reached out and touched the edge of the unwatered succulent. It was dry, brittle, and dying from the inside out. He turned back to his monitor, opened the terminal window, and began to type the SQL commands to sort the fertilizer shipments. The rhythmic, hollow clacking of the plastic keys echoed in his small grey box, the only soundtrack left to a life he had dismantled entirely by his own hand. In the brutal ecosystem of high finance and corporate warfare, arrogance is often the heaviest liability. Brucey Belmont built a fortress of ego, convinced his brilliance was the sole engine of his success, while entirely dismissing the quiet architect who laid his foundation. By weaponizing his divorce to protect his wealth, he unknowingly signed the very documents that dismantled his empire. Claire's revenge was not born of screaming matches or slashed tires. It was a masterclass in silent, surgical precision. She allowed Brucey's own greed to trigger the trap. The tragedy of Brucey Belmont is a timeless cautionary tale. Never underestimate the resolve of a loyal partner who has been pushed too far. And never assume that silence equates to weakness. When the dust settled, the ledger was balanced not by the loud demands of a narcissist, but by the quiet stroke of a Montblanc pen,